Welcome to the Afghanistan Project Podcast. I'm your host, Beth Bailey. I'm happy to introduce today's guest, U.S. Air Force veteran Tanner Yackley. Tanner has over a decade of experience with the MQ-9 Reaper, including serving in a combat capacity as a sensor operator. He's now a PhD candidate and is focusing on the unique mental health challenges that drone operators and support personnel face as veterans. Thank you so much for joining me to talk about this, Tanner. I know so little about what you're going to share, and I'm really excited to learn from you.
Absolutely, Beth. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
It's an absolute honor. I would love to start by asking about your combat service. Where have you deployed in the course of that service?
Sure. And this is the one that always gets everyone, and this is part of the struggle with it. I have deployed nowhere. I've never left the state. I have sat stateside the entire time with it, and that is just a mind-blowing thing if you haven't done it. So I entered the Air Force in 2010. I picked sensor operator because it sounded like a cool job at the time, and nobody knew anything about it back in, especially 15 years ago. Barely anyone knows about it now. And you talk about then, and they're like, the recruiter's like, "You're operating a camera." I'm like, "Well, that sounds cool." I'm like, "Let's go with that job." And then it goes like halfway through tech school, they're like, "You're gonna employ weapons," and I'm like, "Wait, what?" I was like, "Okay, all right." So it was just at that point you're just doing what you have to, kind of thing. But yeah, it never deployed once, but I've got over 1,000 combat missions logged, 2,900 combat hours, out of a total of 3,400 hours, and the 2,900 hours came in the first 4 years. Which, if you compare that with any other fighter pilot and or person in that capacity, that usually takes a 30-year career to amass that many hours. So we were doing triple to quadruple the amount of numbers of hours from the get-go with it. And especially in the early 2010s, where everybody was starting to cover drones, and drones in the news was a very common thing. With it. And so again, yeah, never deployed. I sat in a Connex box outside of Las Vegas. But I had one of the most wild experiences, because while I sat in that box, in outside of Las Vegas, I was controlling the camera, because my job was the enlisted personnel. The MQ-9 takes two people to operate. It takes a pilot that sits in the left seat. They're the ones controlling the banking, everything like that. It's a fly-by-wire system, so it's just very standard controls. Everyone thinks of like the RQ-4, where I'm clicking with a mouse and doing more computer-related tasks and all this. Like, it's just not that technical per se. With it, there's still a lot of just normal aviation aspects to it. So the pilot, though, is the one that controls the plane. They also pull the trigger to employ a weapon, as well. And so that's kind of their job. We'd always call them in the community. This is a community joke. We always call them a glorified bus driver, right? Because really, what it came down to was me controlling the camera. Because if I couldn't see what I needed to see on the ground, well, then what did that mean? Well, the plane had to move. So the pilot and I would have to have a conversation back and forth and say, "Hey, man, I need this." It was a very, going back and forth. And that in itself was a unique aspect to this job. No other job in the U.S. military do I have the potential to sit right next to a full bird colonel, right, in '06, and talk about his wife, his kids, his life, his interests, his favorite football team. Because when you're sitting 6 to 7 hours, like we were in the box, with it, you talked about everything. Who wouldn't? And when you're doing this day in and day out for years on end, you learn a lot about these people, with it. So you bring that dynamic. That's the first dynamic into this that just doesn't make any sense to anyone outside of it. If if I go pull a maintainer off the flight line and be like, hey, go talk to that captain. They're going to be like, ah. And we had such a comfortable, discussions and things like that. It was this weird balance. You were in the hallway and it was, sir, yes, sir. And then you're in the box and it was like, hey, bro, do you want to do blah, blah, blah? Because you just had to get the mission done. You needed to be able to do that and kind of cut the crap out of the conversation and be able to just get plain English out, because that's how fast we would have to move with it. So the back to your original question with the deployment and things like that, never have, right? But again, we'd be in Las Vegas, and I would drive up to the base, and it'd be about a 40-minute drive. And then we'd get a briefing. We'd show up an hour before shift. We'd get a briefing. We'd get all the intel, the weather, if there's anything like that. What's going to be the factor for the day, right? If we're going after someone specific, because there are different mission sets. There's a lot of mission sets that, especially back then, the MQ-9 was trained on. But to keep it simple, usually you have your traditional, I'm doing convoy support there, so I'm watching a convoy of Humvees in a line travel down a road, and usually I'm on comms with the Joint Terminal Air Controller, the JTAC, who's the guy on the ground you see in all the movies of screaming, we need air support, all that stuff. That's the guy that I'd be talking to on the radio the whole time. And so he'd be passing me information, I'd be passing him information, telling him, hey, there's a disturbance up in the road, or there's the potential for a barricade up here, that kind of thing. Let me check it out before you guys go. So we would direct them and have, we'd be making these life or death decisions for them with it. And so it made it a very unique challenge, because while you didn't deploy, you did this strange balance of, in the same 24-hour period, I was in a deployed zone twice, and home, in the middle of that, just trying to sleep, which when you cram a bunch of shift work into years on end, man, was it mismanaged back then. It was just terrible. We were on 7-week rotations. So every 7 weeks we went 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., 4 p.m. to midnight, midnight to 8 a.m. And I did that rotation for 4 years. You want to talk about being on top of, we haven't even gotten into the real stressors here, but you want to talk in just the physiological toll that took on my body was intense. It was constant lack of sleep. It was constant sleep deprivation. And then you're having to go in and sit in these super potential high stress environments, or the opposite. Because everyone thinks in drones, and like they're commonly called, we call them remotely piloted aircraft, or RPAs. I've started calling it drones now. It's just, everybody calls it something different. But really it's the big ones, right? And here's the thing that people don't realize, especially with the MQ-9 Reaper, that aircraft has a 66-foot wingspan. That is not a small aircraft by any means. Everyone thinks of a drone and thinks of a little quadcopter, buzzing around and everything like that. And that's not what this is. It's something 20 feet long and 66-foot wingspan, 10,000 pounds max weight on it with it. So, it's a decent sized aircraft with it. So, it was unique in that aspect, because we did these shifts and we worked these schedules. And then we had, 98% of the time, I'm just sitting there watching some guy tend to his cows, or tend to his livestock, or play with his kids, or, a lot of other things, with it. You talk about all the horrendous things that happened over there. I've seen it through an infrared and or other camera. People can be absolutely brutal to each other with it. And so you saw the rapes, you saw the murders, you saw all those things with it. And it made it tough, with it, especially when there was things that, like, especially the foreign nationals were, at odds with each other, and we didn't necessarily have the rules of engagement to be able to step in. And so then you deal with a piece called moral injury, and needing to understand that I can't do anything and I have to somehow be okay with that. And it's not like after that event happens that someone comes up to you and it's like, hey, I saw your feed and, it looked like that was really tough. Do you want to talk about it afterwards? Hell no. That was a one-way ticket to, you're getting put in the white jacket in the padded room. That's the way the culture was. So everybody was scared to go to anybody and talk about it. The ones that did were labeled, weak and everything else. With it, people got mocked for it. We got told that we couldn't have PTSD with it. We got told that what we did was just a video game, that we weren't real air crew because we weren't actually in a plane because we wore flight suits there. And there's still, I just got off the phone with a buddy 2 weeks ago, and he's getting med boarded out after almost 20 years of service. And the doctor that he's talking to is like, well, you're on drones. How can you have PTSD? And so that's what we're fighting. Is there are still people that don't even understand how this can happen. And with that, I'm like, how dare you? How dare you be so damn ignorant and sit there and look somebody in the eyeball that has watched in some way, shape, or form, because it's not always the action of physically pulling the trigger. There's the intelligence operators that feed us the intel. They can be in our ear, right? And saying like, hey, that's a mortar tube, or hey, that's an RPG, that kind of thing. Or, even the support personnel. It's not like we had this crazy, gigantic bank vault door that 40 doors open to, and it eye scans you to walk in. Like, no, you're walking into a hangar and there's your Connex and you kick open the door and walk in. There's not, that was it. So anybody could walk in there at any time, which presented its own challenges, but that also gave more people a chance to get exposed to trauma in it. So you were in this weird paradox with it and I know we'll talk about this more a little bit probably on the next topic, but it was this weird paradox of I'm sitting there potentially having to do just mind-numbing tasks. You're sitting there, you could be sitting there for 7-8 hours just watching some dude sleep, and I've got to sit there and but if all of a sudden he gets up and walks west, I got to be ready to go in and 30 seconds later have a missile in flight. So I go from a state of sedation and, numbness to now I have to pull off, and it was, and you want to talk about pressure? There was no mistakes. You didn't make a mistake in that career field ever. Now there was different squadrons and different squadrons held people to different standards. And one of the ones I was in was a very, very high standard. And so much so that we had literally on our squadron webpage how successful we were at killing people. We had like a 98.7% success rate for it. It was insane with it. So you talk about being, exposed to all this. It was constant, across the board with it. So, that's the piece of it that was just, while yes, there was no true deployment, my feet never left U.S. soil. I'd argue I've seen more combat than most AFSCs combined, because it was daily, and we'll get into it a little bit, but the leads into the next point of everything we did was recorded. So it wasn't like, oh, I watched this strike go down live and then, all right, done, moving on. Oh, no. Then you go into a room, you watch the strike again with all your peers on your shift, and they sit there and they berate you and they throw spears at you and and tell you, this is all things you could have done better. So you're just under this constant pressure with it, and and then you watch it over and over and over again. And then let's say you did make even just like what we'd call a tactical mistake, right? Maybe something that like the strike outcome still worked out perfectly fine, but maybe I don't know, delayed turning my laser on, or the pilot didn't turn at the right angle of bank or something like that. And they could have made things go faster or something like that. Well, then I have to sit there and rewatch that video over and over and over and over again to learn how to do that better next time. And so it's not me just, the typical World War II analogy where, hey, we chuck the bomb out the back of the aircraft and see ya, I'm out, kind of thing. You don't get to hang around and see what happens. But we had to see the death and destruction, and most of the time it wasn't even from what we were doing, it was what the locals were doing to each other, kind of thing. And because nobody was safe with it, especially with their religion and everything else, nobody was. And so, that part in itself made it exceptionally difficult, and just this really big, I was called this just ball of wire that is so gross, because there's so many factors that went into it and made it challenging, and none of them were addressed during the time. And so now you've got a bunch of people that are out and long gone and are now struggling immensely. And you've got practitioners and things like that that don't understand at all. So you want to talk about, getting mocked for the job that you do, and you hearing, I remember I had an aerial gunner as one of my tech school instructors, and he looked me at the eye and said, "You're the biggest pussy I've ever met in my life. You don't belong in my Air Force." And I'm like, all right, thanks, man. Like, I'm going to keep doing my job. So it's just, there's people that just have such strong opinions against that. And it's like, why? We're saving lives by not putting people at risk. And, and we're doing it very, very precisely and effective across the board. So you're always fighting some stigma or some preconceived notion that somebody had in their mind, whether it was, other people, whatever. There was something that was you were always getting impacted by somebody telling you what you did wasn't real combat.
That's a lot. For sure. I can't even imagine. I'm trying to put myself in those shoes. I guess my question about those, you're not deploying to a place physically, but when during those 7-week stretches, would you generally be in the same AO? So you at least got to know, okay, I know this building, I know this route, this is where this asshole always is. And, at least did you get familiar in that way with different places?
I've been out of combat 10 years. I could walk you on with blindfolded 100 targets right now that I sat on every single day for it. So, yeah, we did. Yeah. Occasionally you'd work other AORs and things like that, but most of the time your squadron was tied to a specific AOR for it, or a specific mission. But, yeah, so I worked a couple different ones, but, yeah, it was just dependent, but it wasn't like you're necessarily having to like jump around rules of engagement too often. That was nice, at least. But yeah, there was definitely some aspects to it that it still obviously presented its challenges.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I can't even imagine if you had to swap up ROE and be like one day you're, yeah, I can do this here, and like, shit, no, I can't.
Yeah.
So, this is the Afghanistan Project Podcast, so I'm going to ask you, were any of your AOs around Afghanistan, especially, like I'm thinking 2010, shit, that's the surge, that's a very tough time.
Yeah, absolutely. We were operating around like the Kandahar area and stuff like that with it, and absolutely. So yeah, and it was, like I said, it was, you never knew what you were walking into either, and that was the hard part with it. It's like, it's not like you get this time where, I'm in a crewed aircraft where like that plane can't leave without me, right? But it's perfectly normal with drone warfare to walk into a ground control station, the aircraft's in the air, on target, spun up, missiles red and ready to go, and the leadership makes the decision, all right, this is probably gonna take too long, so swap crews. And so then like it would be during like a shift change type of thing. So then I have to rely on the information that I'm given, make my own inferences of what's happening, hope I have everything right in my own head, and then potentially pull a trigger within 30 seconds of sitting down at those controls, or 8 hours later. It's anybody's guess at that point, because we always said the classic quote of the enemy gets a vote, right? We need them to turn left, they turn right, kind of thing. When you walk out the door, they don't ever leave the door, kind of thing. So because of those aspects to it, it made it exceptionally challenging, because you had not a clue what day you were walking into that day for it. So, that in itself made it a challenge, because, you'd walk in and all of a sudden it was like, oh, hey, in 10 minutes, there's going to be a strike that happens with it. And you're like, oh, okay, I guess I'm going to kind of mentally prepare for that and super quick and just jump in and hope I can warm my hands up and get the muscle memory back, to do what I was doing with it there. So it made its challenges for sure. Absolutely. So I apologize. My service dog is going nuts right now. Right here. Yes. Hello. All right. Back.
Yeah. My non-service dog is going to probably be making himself known at some point, because he can't get through the night without going out 4 different times at this point in his life. And so I have already heard him up there just going nuts. It's going to be a dog day. It's a great thing.
Yes.
So you've kind of talked about, I was going to ask you next about the operational tempo, but you've kind of talked about how it's not the same day to day, not the same shift to shift. I mean, just kind of all over the place. And I mean, you've talked about how difficult that was too. Do you think it weighed on you at the time?
No.
Or do you think that, so tell me about how you handled it at the time versus when you began to realize that, like, oh, this is something that is impacting my life.
No, absolutely. I mean, at the time, it was one of those things where, you definitely didn't realize it. I mean, you were conditioned so well, and everything was built on, around camaraderie. And I mean, of course it has to be, it's what we did was very unique. And, we're still truly the only ones that understand, what other drone personnel have been through with it. So there's a lot of camaraderie with it, with the operations, and it made, that flip flop. And like I said, we called it flipping the switch, going from home to work to home. Well, now I gotta, leave home and maybe deal with an angry landlord or an overdue bill, or, I gotta remember to get milk on the way home. And then I go into work and watch a whole bunch of horrendous things happen, and then turn around and be like, oh yeah, I gotta get milk. Like, it's, or not, like, rip the cashier's head off at some gas station because it was just, I'm just in an mad mood from the shift or whatever happened, because again, there was this ownership with it. And so, and that's the other piece too with this that I'll get into first before I dive into that point, is we trained where we operated, which is a very unique aspect to this, because most aircraft and things like that, right, they train stateside, and then they go to combat, and they are in a deployed environment where they are operating the entire time. And so they kind of get to make this nice clean split and break between training and operational. It was super typical for me, because I was also a combat instructor. So I was teaching people how to do the missions, teaching people how to do the tactics, teaching people how to employ weapons, different things like that. And so because of that, and there it goes. There goes my train of thought. Love that. 1 sec, I'll get it back.
You were training people, you were
Yes.
saying.
Oh yes. So very common for you could sit 2 hours in the box, is what we'd call it, and then I could go run out really quick, throw up a briefing board, brief a student, put them through a 2-hour training event, debrief them in 30 minutes, and then jump back in the box for the last, if I did my math right, 2 hours or whatever that is, 2-3 hours at the end. Not uncommon. So you want to talk about, the mental gymnastics you're having to jump through with that. It was a lot. And like I said, at the time, it was just, this is the job. We were told, always that we're the tip of the spear. We're, making the impact. And, because what did we do? The unique aspect of this of not having that truly deployed environment is I would go home, turn on the news, and they'd be like, "Oh, drone strike here," and I'm like, "That was me. That's weird." And like, I remember I was on a plane one time, and some dude had a paper, and we started talking about, what I did in the military and things like that, and I told him I was on drones, and he was, an hour had gone by. We had sat there, our initial chit chat had died down, and we're just kind of sitting there in our own worlds on the plane, and he's reading a paper, and all of a sudden he gets to a page, and he nudges me, and he goes, "Hey," and there's an article about a drone strike. He goes, "Haha, was this you?" And it was, and that was the weirdest experience I've ever had. With that, like, it was like I was just like, no, okay, I'm gonna look at. I need a coffee or something. Like, it's just like I'm like, what the heck? So it's just again these unique aspects to it that aren't normal per se. And the training aspect was a huge part of it because it was just constantly you were exposed. I remember I was finishing up a check ride one time, which is like the kind of quality control, if you will. And yeah, it's like an annual exam. Every year you get one, it says, "Hey, can you still do your job? Can you still do all these functions?" You get evaluated doing them. And I remember it was my very first squadron I was with, and I was getting a check ride, and a troops in contact call came over the radio in the middle of my check ride. I had flown in Afghanistan for all of like 10 hours at that point. And then I'm hearing this radio chatter in which immediately the instructor that's teaching me has to then swap me out, right? I have to like get up and move around, and that can be awkward, especially if I'm in like some situation where I'm like following a vehicle and I've got to have constant input on a control. I can't necessarily just go, "Oh, hey, bad guy, can you pause for a second so we can change out?" And I can let go of my input for my camera. Like, no, you're doing this awkward, like, "Oh, let me reach over and grab the control, and then you slide out this way, I slide in this way, and try to move this, and make sure I don't knock a keyboard off, and all these silly things." But it was what we did, with it, and it was there was so many little aspects like that made it just complicated across the board. So that was really it. And then, like I said, just the lack of downtime. There was no dwell. I had 4 years of combat. And that's the thing that when you tell people, like, people always look at combat as how many deployments did you do? And you should see the looks I get when someone says, "Well, how much combat time did you do?" And I go, 4 years. And they go, "What?" Like, people can't comprehend that, with it. Because that'd be a ton, if you were depending on how long your rotations were and everything else with it. But and it was just, like I said, constant. There was never any stoppage of what you were doing or anything like that. It was just constantly every single day you're dealing with combat in some way. Because even if I'm not actively watching it, I might be watching old strike footage that we had direct access to and can pull up on any computer in the building and, making lesson plans or, creating new tactics or that kind of thing for it. So it was just this constant exposure all the time throughout the process.
Well, so when you left the Air Force, you kept working with the Reaper. So what was that like, transitioning from, doing the combat role to still working with the MQ-9?
Yeah, and it was what everybody did. Because when you walk out and you're like, "What skill?" They tell you in their transition program, they're like, "What skills do you have?" And I'm like, "Well, I can employ Hellfire missiles from 30,000 feet with laser precision and hit a target in a foot and a half radius." And then it's like that doesn't really translate to like anything. I'm like, maybe I guess you could like be one of those guys that controls the camera and like watches a hockey puck. Maybe I'd be good at that. I don't know. But it was, you were still in it, right? And oh, by the way, I got out, worked for a contracting company, a very large contracting company that deals with the MQ9, and then, like, it was like a family reunion, right? Like half the people I'd worked in combat with were there. So you're still talking about the same thing. You're still exposed to the same thing. You're still having the same conversations. You're still being like, oh, hey, by the way, this one time when we were on this mission or doing this, it just never goes away with it, and especially for me in 2018 when I got out, I thought, it was like, I'm just a hard charger and, just holding myself to a high standard. I didn't realize, oh no, I've got a bunch of crippling anxiety with it that, is giving me this insane, like, I feel like a stake is in my chest kind of thing because it's so strong. I always tell people that, and or it feels like someone's grabbing my rib cage and trying to rip it apart. And I deal with that daily. And I've sit there and done a cocktail of medications and every other therapy and processing therapy and behavioral therapy and EMDR and written exposure, and they all seem like band-aids, fixes and things like that. And so that's where, and I'm sure this will be the next transition here, but that's one of the reasons what stemmed me to pursue this in academia, because it was just there was so much misinformation, so much just nobody understood it. You can't have it. What do you mean? You never deployed. You can't have PTSD. That kind of thing. And, oh, well, your records don't show anything. It's like, well, it's because I couldn't go to a flight dock and say anything because then I'd be reprimanded, and then I hurt my team. So they really played on that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to ask you if there was like an inciting incident or incidents that led to that abrupt switch to go get a PhD from that, or was it just like the constant wear of all of that? I mean,
yeah, it was it was really the constant wear of it, because there wasn't really a single event per se. It was really coming down, and I had a really good friend that I met working for the company that I did, and him and I sat down, and it was this funny little, like, we're both sitting across the table from each other and we're looking at each other, and it's like, do you got a VA rating? Right? It's like, because like nobody wants to talk about it. Everyone's like, oh, disability. Well, you're, at the time I was like 28. I'm like, and so people look at me and they, of course look at me and go, you don't have anything wrong with you. And it's like, it's because it's all up here, kind of thing. And so then we started talking about it and realizing, one, how much just information we didn't know about the VA. And then we really realized, after going through it for so many years, and that there just wasn't that much support and or knowledge. And it was about the 8th time that I walked into a doctor's office, looked them in the face and said, do you know what a drone is? And they were like, yeah. And I'm like, all right, here we go. Let me spend 25 minutes of this 30-minute appointment explaining how this is possible with it. And it's insane because in the Diagnostical Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, or the DSM-5, under post-traumatic stress disorder, there's a criterion alpha 4, and there's a note that says you cannot have PTSD from electronic exposure unless it is work related. And there's not a single doc in the field that recognizes that. There's very few, let's put it that way, with it. And it's like, it's right there. And then you talk about all the terrible things and stuff like that. I mean, just like I said, there's not a single, and that's my biggest gripe with all of this, not to get on a tangent here, but with all of this is when you look and you start breaking down these questionnaires and DBQs and all of these things that they use in psychology, What's the one phrase that is uttered in every single one of them? And that phrase is the event. Tell me about the event. And I was getting frustrated at the beginning of when I got out, because I'm looking at them going, I don't have one event. I've got thousands of events. I'm like, because if you take what I saw, the traumas that I watched at my hands, and then the traumas that I had to have repeated exposure of over and over and over again by watching, reoccurrent strike videos and things like that, I've seen tens of thousands of people die in every way possible, in the most brutal way possible. There. So it really just, because of all that, and I looked at the system and went, this can't be it. Like, and I remember I went to my first counselor, and I literally looked her in the eye, and she made some comment. She goes, well, because you're a combat veteran, blah, blah, blah. And I said the words. I said, I'm not a combat veteran. Like, like, what are you talking about? She's like, what? Yeah, you are. And I'm like, no, I'm not. Like, I had an internal struggle for probably a good year and a half of trying to even recognize with it. And that's one now that a lot of people still don't understand. People look at it, and so there's this stigma with it all of, oh, you're on drones, you have PTSD. Well, you're just weak-minded. It's get over it, and all of the terrible stigma things with that. And it's like, are you kidding me? I'm like, these people sat here and got exposed to these terrible things over and over and over again. And for me, it became personal, because then I started getting the calls, and we're talking years later. And I started having some, I've got about 7-8 people that I have close to me that I've gotten a call from, every single one of them in the last 3 years. And every single one of them, they call me and they're bawling. And they go, I don't understand what's happening in my own head. And I go, I know exactly how you feel. It is a terrifying feeling. Because one, it's not PTSD, it's complex PTSD. It's the same thing with that when you look at it with military sexual trauma or any sexual trauma or anything like that with it. They fall very closely in line with each other because of that. And so when I started looking at all these things, and then having, dealing with people calling and because I was just getting into the VA stuff at that time and kind of figuring a couple things out, and I had made a website at the time, and trying to kind of compile all the resources, as I got so agitated with there being 1,000 pages on the VA site, and trying to find some specific link, and the guides are muddled, and they're weird, and they don't make sense. And so I started just building guides with a buddy of mine, and we built this entire website and ran it for about 2 years, and then it just got too costly, and life got in the way. But that's really where it came down to, that was just trying to help people navigate that. And then it kind of just evolved, and my fiance and I were talking, and at the time, and it was like, I was looking at, because I started working at the university, and the whole transition to that was because of recognizing that I had PTSD and I needed to get out of that career field. So that's why I had finished up my master's degree. I've got both a bachelor's and a master's from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. Those degrees are in aeronautics. And then I'm working on my PhD right now currently in psychology for general experimental. Just because the human cognition is just so fascinating to me. And now, like, the more I learn about it and the more that I understand it when in relation to trauma, I'm just fascinated by it all. With it, and especially with how many people I've had in my life come up and say, I can predict what they're going to tell me with, like, man, I was thinking this way. I'm like, yeah, you feel like you got a ping pong ball that's fired off at 1,000 miles an hour inside your skull when you're trying to keep your thought process in check, and you're freezing up, and you get into fight, flight, freeze, fawn, those responses with it. And for me, I've got all four manifest in some way, and it's strange, but It's one of those. It's taken me years to recognize because again, it's just been this constant uphill battle, and so that's where that's driven me for all of this. Is going. There's nobody that wanted to support us back then. The people that did lead us and things like that want no business in helping us now. The VA won't do a thing. The VA doesn't understand it, and there's not. I mean, we're still dealing with criteria and manuals from the 70s, like when they called it shell shock. So, and we're so far past that at this point. And so then, these veterans are getting put through these rudimentary, very baseline therapies that don't work. And they might band-aid for a couple weeks or a month, then you go right back into it. And so that's what drove me with all of this is going, this can't be it. And if this is it, like, I don't accept that because I'm having too many people close to me calling me and answering those calls. And and it's not like these are like, I don't want to downplay anyone's service, but like run of the mill people that I served with, these were the best of the best. These were your evaluators, your instructors, your combat instructors. These are the people that with a moment's notice had ice in their veins and could pull off any tactic at any time. And now, like, can't even walk into a store without having a complete mental break because they forgot their grocery list at home and their process, their checklist is now broken. And now their brain doesn't know what to do because your brain conditioned for years on end that I have to follow the checklist and I have to follow it to the T. And while I can deviate, and there's times, the checklist is what keeps everything together. And so it's little things like that I started noticing and realizing, whoa, this is affecting me in a lot more ways than I thought it was previously. And it's all the way down to like when I would sit at dinner tables or any table out to eat, whatever it was. See if I can get it on camera here. But I would sit with my hands like this essentially, and my forearms leaned up against the edge of the table, and I'd have my hands almost in the air. And it took my fiance looking at me, and she goes, "Why are you doing that?" And I said, "What?" And she goes, "Why are you holding your hands like that?" And I even had my thumbs up. And I realized it was because that's how I sat at the controls. It's because that's what was comfortable at the controls. Even when you were relaxed, you still always had your fingers right next to the button because at any time you were ready to go. And so you talk about this wave of emotion and everything else with it, and then these strange things that are now manifesting themselves into other areas, and then you get all the typical hypervigilance, nightmares. You want to talk about a weird experience? Try dreaming in infrared. I can guarantee you almost everybody's done it. It's wild. It's one of the most surreal experiences with it. And so because of, this being such a personal thing for me is what got me into this shift to the psychology field and realizing like, wait a minute, if I can do this and I can at least educate people and do it and be able to speak the language of psychology and tie that into what we did, maybe, just maybe, I can prevent from losing their life over this. Because constantly you get the ideations and everything else with this that are just horrendous with it. And it's just, and you get to a point where you get so numb to it all, just like we did back then, right? I remember walking into work and being like, man, I really hope we kill somebody tonight. Because that's what we were conditioned to do. That was our box check that we did our job. We needed to. And so and then doing that for so long and then trying to remove yourself from it really made it complicated. And made it even more complicated to understand what the heck do I do after the fact to even get help, because I'm getting told in 10 different ways that what I went through isn't valid.
Wow. So tell me how long, so you've been at the University of North Dakota for how long pursuing?
This is my 4th year.
Okay. What have you turned up so far? Have you been able to find any things that, I mean, you listed a litany of things that you have personally tried that didn't do anything. So do you have any breakthroughs or positive things to kind of report
Yeah, I
after all
mean,
that?
so one thing that I'm doing right now is I'm actually working on getting a survey pushed out to drone operators, and I'm hoping right now the timeline kind of keeps getting moved around just because of a lot of paperwork with everything, obviously, and approvals. But I'm hoping by the end of next month to get this thing pushed out, and I've already got over 100 participants with it. And it pulls a lot with the PTSD checklist, the 20 question questionnaire that's out there, and then I added in my own personal demographics just because of my background knowledge and being able to isolate out not only the air crew that were physically there, like myself, but the support personnel too, because I know that they, it didn't matter intel if they were working, inputting numbers behind a desk. If they had access to a GCS, they could get exposed, and everybody had access. So, or they'd walk in to tell somebody something, and they walk into an op cell, and there's 20 screens across there, and all of them are live drone feeds, here, and here. So the study is really looking at that and being able to shed light on it and I'm doing it with the veteran population because a lot of them, there's a great researcher called Wayne Chappell that did 2 different studies. Actually, I think he did 3 technically. One in 2014, one in 2019, and I think they just published one in 2023. And they mainly focus on active duty, and so they like pulled the squadrons and stuff like that, which is great. But I think that there's a very large link in how far removed you are from it. And I also don't think any of the symptoms truly manifest until you stop doing the job. Because your brain is so good then at flip, just flipping that switch. Home, work, home, work, home, work, home, work. And it's not until you stop doing that does your brain recognize like, something's not right here. And it hits you like a brick wall. And it's terrifying. And there's no other way to talk about it. It's terrifying. Dealing with it, and it's on another extreme level that people do not understand. But I'm sorry, but if you lock somebody in a box for 4 years, had them watch the most horrendous things possible that people can do to each other, and then open the box and said, all right, go be free, like, what would you expect otherwise? At that point. So it's unfortunate, but that's what's made it personal. That's why I'm advocating. That's why I'm pushing, and I won't stop until everyone knows what a drone is and how someone in the community can get PTSD, because there's so many people that are just painfully struggling right now, and there's zero support across the board.
Yeah, so nothing has changed. That was going to be my other question. Man, I really sound bad. Nothing has been addressed. Like, none of this is being talked about inside the Air Force in the community.
It's gotten better. Let's put it that way. It's gotten better. I mean, obviously, I can't speak to, since I've been out for 7 years, where they're fully at, but also, the dynamics have changed since we pulled out of Afghanistan, with that. So a lot of things are a lot unarmed, with the missions and stuff like that. But it's still, like I said, at the end of the day, the trauma is trauma. It doesn't take, I think where my generation, and I say that anyone in the 2000s to 2014, 2015, just God bless them, because they went through absolute hell for dealing with that, and with just the worst hand dealt, and everybody just got told, shut up and color, and you don't matter, but do this super insane job. I mean, I did my first strike before I could have a beer legally. I pulled the trigger at 20 years old, and killed my first person at 20 years old. And so it's like, so how to process that was non-existent, because it didn't happen. It was just like, all right, good strike. We went through all the details and everything else, and then it was like, all right, go home. Like, it wasn't like, hey, you just went through a really traumatic experience, you should go talk to somebody about that. Granted, that was out there, but that was also a death wish for it, in the community. Again, the stigma, it killed us. It was, it was laughed at. It was all of it. You couldn't have it. And I don't think it's taken until at least in the last couple years, like I said, for people to truly start understanding that, holy crap, no, this is a real thing. And this isn't just things that people threw their hands up. We had onesie twosies throughout the that decade, especially, that threw their hands up and said, like, hey, I'm not doing it. And everybody was like, oh, they laughed at them, and then snickered, and, oh, they're just trying to get out and, get that money, kind of thing. And it was like, and then a lot of us got out and went, oh, wait, no, this is a huge thing with it. And really what it comes down to is it's like a sniper, right? And Wayne Phelps does a great job with this in the book On Killing Remotely. He was in the Marines. He commanded some drone units, and I've had a handful of conversations with him via LinkedIn. And so it's been great, learning that aspect to it. But you had this intimate, understanding of your targets, or in our case, your people that you're going after, right? And so, you knew when the kids were getting home. You knew when the dude was going to go do his market run because it was Friday. You knew when he's heading this direction out from his compound. He must be going to, tend to his cattle, or the non-glorious stuff, right? Like I said, it's his time to, see his fourth wife, and watch them, do their thing on top of a roof, kind of thing. I mean, all of it. You had people just crapping in ditches, you name it. It didn't matter with it. And like I said, you had people gunning each other down in the streets. It was crazy with it. And like I said, you imagine it. I've seen it across the board, and especially just the way that they would treat each other, and for little things and stuff like that was just horrendous with it. I mean, essentially giving people the death penalty in some of the most screwed up ways possible with it, because we deal with hostage situations, and there's times where that didn't go well, kind of things. So we had to watch people get executed with it, and we're not, and that's not even talking about the stuff that we did with missiles. It's like, so that's the hard part. Is it's like you've got this moral disengagement from what you're doing, but you've got a long-term connection with your targets, because I can sit there and tell you exactly where this dude's house is, how many goats he has, how many kids he has, how many wives he has, and everything in between. So it's like I said, this is just a melting pot of very unique challenges that definitely, I can't even say the average person, that nobody outside the career field understands with it. And like I said, and then you throw it, the other piece of this is with, you got out of your combat unit, and the promise was the Holy Land, right? The Holy Land was the formal training unit for the military, right? The schoolhouse, where we taught everybody, they touched the controls for the first time, and it was like, hey, you're going Monday through Friday, some ACC family days in there, this is going to be great. Oh, heck no. They put you on a 20-hour window, essentially, that you could work an 8-hour shift anywhere in that window on any given day. And during the summer for 3 months, that started at 2 a.m. And I would have to be in a room at 2 a.m, writing on a whiteboard and writing out a briefing board to brief my student on what my expectations were for the day at 2 a.m. And 90% of the time, it was me having to go track some dude down because he overslept. Because who is awake at 2:30 in the morning to get a brief to go train from 4 to 6 in the morning, kind of thing. And then, by the way, by Friday, I was probably leaving work by, I don't know, 10 p.m. So they would just start shifting and shifting and shifting because we were protected from, short, like, you couldn't do like a 8-hour shift and then another 8-hour shift. You'd crew rest of a 12-hour duration, and that's typical for any flying career field anywhere. Doesn't matter. F-16s, MQ-9s. You have 12 hours that once you get done with your duties, you cannot come back for 12 hours, which is great, but it doesn't protect you from going the other way. So I could start off at 2 a.m. and then the next day I got to go 10 a.m. at my start, and that's an 8-hour shift to the right. And then the next day I got to go to a 4 p.m. start. And I just did that in 72 hours. And it was constant. And so it was 3.5 years of that on top of the shift work I just did. And then, all the leadership has the audacity to turn around and look at you and go, hey, do you want to go back and do combat again? Because I'm young and I don't have the rank to go in and do supervisory roles and do what we call above the line, or which is just your Monday through Friday. I'm going to do a bunch of admin work, that kind of thing. Take care of, people, not do the job. So it's like, so that was my whole reason of getting out. It was like, hey, do you want to go do this again? And I'm like, no, I don't. I don't want, I'm so tired at this point. Like I was just, my sleep was terrible. It was just, and every coping mechanism we had, which is mainly alcohol, was terrible, across the board. And so then that exacerbated everything. So like I said, you talk about the melting pot, like every single way was that mishandled. And it's just, like I said, wreaking havoc on these people that are now turning around and having to deal with the fallout of all this. And so that's the hard part with it all, is just there's so much that we got told throughout, and so many things got downplayed, and so many high pressure scenarios and high stakes environments. And, you couldn't afford to be wrong, and that was the mentality. The mentality was perfection. I heard it probably weekly that when we walked through the doors of that squadron, we were stone cold killers and nothing else. And I don't see that as necessarily a negative thing. We were doing our job. But that mentality and being told that day in and day out for years on end, it just completely rewires everything of the way you think and the way you process information. And then it leads to all these other problems. Sorry about that. With the, with your cognitive abilities, with all these things outside of it, and then you're fighting a system that doesn't understand a lick of what you're doing.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about so many of the drone stories I would hear during GWAT were not good ones. Hitting a wedding party, which honestly, every time I heard that, as somebody who was a TBSL analyst doing cross-border, I'm like, yeah, it's a wedding party, my ass. Like, it's not. Or you're, but still, you guys were on blast if anything went wrong. Like what happened at HKIA, on was it like the 29th or the 27th with the family being targeted. It's almost worse for a drone operator than if it were just, you guys got crapped on with anything that went wrong.
And we had to stick around and watch. That's the biggest difference too. It wasn't like, hey, I dropped my bomb out my aircraft, it hits my target, I'm like, cool, good engagement, I'm out. Oh no. I gotta sit there and I gotta watch the pieces get picked up. I gotta watch the body parts get picked up. I gotta watch all these things. And then I gotta figure out where this dude gets buried, because then that plays a factor in, who he was, etc. kind of thing. So then I gotta go watch the body get dumped on top of it. And that could be a hospital or a mass grave. It's just so that part in itself, and then so that also means I have to deal with, if this happens outside of some person's home, well, now I got to deal with some wife that's like hysterical, and like and stop me if I'm getting too much detail here, but I've watched half a guy get drug across the field by his wife. He just has arms, and he had no legs. And you could just tell. I mean, even in infrared, that she was distraught at that. And that was one of the very first things I saw as a drone operator. With it, it's literally, I don't want to say it framed it, but that's the reality of what we saw. With it, and like I said, to just repeated exposure over and over and over again, day in and day out for years on end. And it's just baffling to me that it's like no one was like, maybe this is a really bad idea. And then like maybe we should have some support and stuff after the fact. Because wow, it's just you got all these unique aspects to it, and then you just kick people out to the community afterwards and say good luck. And then you get, my first thing with the VA was I had an intern diagnosed me with adjustment disorder. And I was like, I had the DSM-5 on her desk, and I was pointing. I was so mad. I was beyond mad. And I was pointing it out, and I'm like, this. I'm like, explain it. I'm like, explain how this doesn't fit this criteria. And they couldn't at the time. They just didn't know. Yeah. And so that's really the piece to this of all of this, and why I'm doing all of this is because not only for the study aspect of this and being able to, get these people's voices heard, but just knowing that somebody is in their corner. Because for 15 years, I've had to fight this process all by myself and get told every step of the way that nothing I've dealt with is valid, nothing I have seen is real, and not real trauma and everything else. And personally, to hell with it all. If I'm at the point where I'm not gonna sit here and watch my friends and brothers and sisters suffer because nobody wants to do a dang thing about it with it. And I actually also created a Discord community for combat veteran drone operators and support personnel, to be able to just have a place to go and talk. Because while there's groups and things like that, it always centers around the same stuff, right? It's always, oh man, just shove it down and drink it away. And so I've used every single resource that I have pulled in the last 7 years, and there is a lot, and put it into this, server. And so that way when people are trying to navigate this for the first time, they're not just getting absolutely throttled and understanding nothing, especially when they get out, and because you get just meat raffled with some of these VAs. Some of them are good, don't get me wrong, but some of them are horrendous still. And the more that you have to advocate for yourself, and you have to do the work yourself, because no one's going to do it for you, because no one knows any better. And so that's why I'm doing all of this, is just trying to get the education piece and get a change and see a change and be the change. Because there's too many people that operated at such insanely high levels and did incredible things for this country. I mean, literal, like I said earlier, tip of the spear, making the biggest impacts that the things that we thwarted and stopped and that the world will never know is incredible. And then to be just kicked and cast aside at the end of it, I won't take that for an answer. And so I'm on a personal mission to do anything and everything that I can to change that narrative and change the help for these people, because myself and all of them deserve a hell of a lot better than what we're getting from everyone around us, including our own.
Yeah, well, when you're in that reward mechanism, right, where it benefits you to do that, like, you kind of have to play in, it sounds like, and that's what everybody is doing to get along. And I think what you're doing is incredibly important.
Absolutely.
I'm really excited to get to see where that goes. That's the most devastating thing I think about war, is that when we try to care for our warfighters, we can't look ahead, right? You can't know
Mm-hmm.
what's going to happen until
Mm-hmm.
you've got that, like, Agent Orange exposure,
Yeah.
for instance. And I mean, just God, the PACT Act. It's
Yep.
funny, the PACT Act used to make me so angry because
Mm-hmm.
it didn't include all these novel cancers
Mm-hmm.
that burn pit exposure was being linked to.
Yep.
But now we're regressing to no PACT Act. It's like, wait,
Yeah.
no, don't do that. No,
We went the
that was
wrong
better
way.
than nothing. Yeah.
Yes.
It's like, God damn.
Yeah.
Why? Why is
Yeah.
this? But that is just that's the nature of the beast. It doesn't
Yep.
make it okay, but somebody has to pioneer it. Somebody has to realize that it needs to happen, and you've done that.
Absolutely.
And that's really great, harnessing all of that information too, so that people don't have to face
It's
it
a
alone.
struggle. It's like, God,
yeah.
we've already gone through enough, and to get out and not even have a clue of where to start, and dealing with all this stuff, with people getting told that, well, you can't have that, and then, what are you supposed to do with that? It's already hard enough. We all know it. That's the one thing that I think in the last couple of years that is good to an extent, is people are at least aware of mental health. Now I think there's a lot of hollow support for that, unfortunately. But we're at least talking about it, which is a start. But that's the thing. It's like, so then people are reaching out, but then the coin of it is, it's like, then you get the people going, well, you can't have that. And it's like, what are they supposed to do past that? Where are they supposed to go with being told that? It's not helpful, right? It's just, there's no validation there. And then you start going, am I freaking crazy? Because everybody around me for my entire career and post career has told me that I can't have this, and that this can't happen to me. And oh boy, are they all so wrong, across the board. And so, that's where I'm starting to bring in things on like weekly topics I'm going to cover on like some of my socials and stuff like that on this, and just and bringing this education piece to it. Because there's just so many that just don't understand. And why would they? But at the same time, we got to do a better job of supporting these warfighters that did so much for us.
I absolutely agree. Well, I would love to give you the last word. If there's anything I didn't ask, anything you want to mention, please, Tanner. It's your hope. It's open to you.
Sure. No, I appreciate that. No, I mean, biggest thing I can say is one, obviously it's real, depression, anxiety, PTSD, all those types of things, they can absolutely affect these warfighters. So even if you're a person as a supervisor, or you're a commander, or you just know somebody that deals with drones, please do not downplay what they went through, because man, have we figured out a real good way to mask it. And we do it every day, because like I said, that's all we've known. All we've known is how to mask all this. And the second it is, so it makes it so exceptionally hard for those people to even say anything and reach out and want help. And so when they do, they've already struggled enough. For the love of God, just listen to them and know what they're saying is real, and that the trauma and the exposure is real, and it affects them in every single way, and that they even woke up and put their feet on the ground that day is a damn win 90% of the time, because none of us want to, and so many are hurting because of it. And like I said before, just listen to them, care just a little bit, and don't dismiss this service, because God, did we go through hell. And coming out the other side sucks, especially when there's no support. So, especially to the veteran community, we got to quit eating our own. We got to fight for each other, and we got to fight for this, because it doesn't matter what it is, and it doesn't matter what you're struggling with, if it's combat related or not. Mental health is mental health, and trauma is trauma, and it needs to get addressed. And people need to understand that it's the exact same if I go out and fracture my leg if I have a mental health disorder, as far as looking and needing treatment. You know, you're not just going to ignore it and shove it down and go, I'm okay, kind of thing, and this will be okay. So it needs to get looked at like that. It needs to get looked at as, this isn't, oh, it's all in your head, and all those crappy things that people say with it. And it just, yeah, it just, there's so much to it that these people are struggling bad, and they need as much and any support that they can get at this time. So that's really what I can leave with, is just don't downplay it, and for the love of God, just listen to them, because they're some of the most incredible people and smartest people I've ever met, as far as tactical problem solvers and thinking on their feet. And they are, but sometimes it just takes them a second to remember what they were saying.
Yeah, I have that problem. And I don't have I mean, we all, that's the thing, is these are very human things.
Absolutely.
And but it takes a while to come back to that. If you've, trained yourself to do a lot of different kinds of things. I just thank you so much, Tanner. I really appreciate all that you shared. I feel like I've learned a whole lot, and like I said, I can't wait to watch and see what you do with all this. And I want to thank listeners for sharing your time too, for supporting veterans, for supporting anybody who was involved in the Afghan war, and Tasha Kaur, and hope to see you all again soon.